Thank you for joining this webinar, Spotlight on Inter-Entity Trade for Sage 300. My name is Nathalie from Orchid Systems, and today Anne and I are joined by Robert Lavery from Robert Lavery & Associates, Orchid distributor in North America. Together we will present on inter-entity trade, focusing on automating transactions in accounts payable and accounts receivable. Last year, we presented webinars on inter-entity transactions and inter-entity trade, focusing on order entry and purchase orders. Inter-entity trade is used to create reciprocal documents in Sage 300 when related entities trade products or services with each other. Today, we will present on automating transactions in accounts payable and accounts receivable, where mirroring AP and AR invoices and the related settlements with AP payments and AR receipts between entities. We'll explore the features and benefits of inter-entity trade and examine two scenarios where inter-entity trade mirrors AP and AR transactions. As inter-entity has highly configurable rules, we can't demonstrate all the configuration examples in a 1-hour webinar. Instead, we will share some setup tips for inter-entity trade and address frequent support questions around mapping fields and how target transactions are created. We will also look at using inter-entity trade audit logs and periodic processing. It's a really important part of using inter-entity. Finally, we will discuss examples of using inter-entity trade with other Orchid modules such as inter-entity transactions, extender, and document management link. The Inter-Entity Suite is designed to give you tight control over transactions spanning multiple entities in Sage 300, either within one database or multiple databases. It streamlines processing and eliminates duplicate data entry, and as a result, it increases the accuracy of your financial data. Accounting staff who have implemented Inter-Entity reports saving days of effort every month. There are two main parts to inter-entity. Inter-entity transactions is designed to automatically create loan account entries between entities and works with all subledgers, including banks. Inter-entity trade is used when related entities trade products and services with each other. You can use order entry, purchase order, accounts receivable, accounts payable, and reciprocal documents are automatically generated to mirror the transactions. Let's now focus on inter-entity trade. Do you need it? Do you manage multiple entities that trade goods and services with one another? Do you have to on-charge expenses between one entity and another? Are you overwhelmed by the volume of inter-entity transactions that flow from your complex trading environment? Could you save time by automatically generating some of these reciprocal documents, eliminating the need for duplicate data entries and simultaneously improving accuracy and auditability? If so, consider using inter-entity trade to automate your transaction flows. With inter-entity trade, you initiate a transaction in one entity and the system handles the rest. Transactions are entered once and replicated across companies. You define the rules for creating these documents, and you map the information that flows between them. Those rules are highly configurable, and you can design it to map your business processes. You can do this within a single Sage 300 database or across multiple databases. Inter-entity trade includes comprehensive audit logging, and we will review it in today's presentation. Inter-entity trade supports various transaction types, including mirrored buy and sell transactions using AR and AP, IE and PO. When settling these transactions, you can use mirrored receipts and payments through AR and AP. You can also create purchase orders from sales orders with flexible configuration options, such as bi-directional processing, allowing you to initiate transactions in one company and ship, invoice, or settle them in another. Typically, clients who use inter-entity trade have complex organizational structures. For example, a customer places a purchase order with a sales company. that will ship and invoice the customer, but the sales company may place an order with a distribution company, which in some cases may order from their manufacturing company. You might have a group company that provides services to other entities and needs to on-charge expenses. All these transactions between the different entities can be mirrored with inter-entity trade. I will now let Rob give us an overview of the functionality of the inter-entity suite.
This presentation reviews the functionality of the inter-entity trade module from Orchid Systems. As you may be familiar, inter-entity transactions is the module where you process intercompany entries through loan accounts that you create through the linked accounts, the due to, due from loan accounts that we process in the general ledger. This supports expense allocations, revenue allocations, and also cash management entries where you wish to receive money on behalf of another company or make payments on behalf of another company, or manage the loan of cash between related party entities. And these are all cleared through loan accounts in the general ledger. But what happens when you want to buy and sell between related parties? This is where the inter-entity trade module comes in. Using inter-entity trade, we have the ability to create an AP invoice that creates an AR invoice in the same or a different Sage 300 company database, or vice versa. We can create an AR invoice, which then creates an AP invoice in the same or a different Sage 300 company. You can also process AP credits to AR credits and vice versa, or AP payments to AR receipts and vice versa. So it's possible to create AR to AP subledger-based transactions, so you actually have invoices that you can settle through payment transactions, as opposed to creating loan account entries that are settled by transferring money or just offsetting due to and due from accounts across one or multiple entities.
Thanks, Rob. Now I'm going to ask Anne to do some more detailed demonstration of using inter-entity trade. First example, a group company raises an AR invoice. Inter-entity trade will create the mirrored AP invoice in the second group entity automatically. In the second example, we will look at using inter-entity trade together with inter-entity transactions. And in the third example, we'll look at the inter-entity settlement. So when an AP payment is made in the second entity, the mirrored AR receipt is created automatically in the first company. Over to you, Anne.
Thanks, Nathalie. In this first scenario, I'm going to demonstrate raising an AR invoice in Company 1 for rent, and inter-entity trade will create the mirrored AP invoice in Company 2. I'm going to use the sales company, Orc Limited, and it invoices the distribution company, Orchid 2, for the monthly rent. When this AR invoice is posted, inter-entity trade uses the configuration for the AR customer to AP vendor trade partnership to get the target company and the account mappings to use. And so I'm going to raise an AR invoice against 9992 in Orc Limited, and IE Trade will create an AP invoice in Orchid 2 against vendor 9991. I'm going to use the 4210-1 rental revenue account in Company 1, Orc Limited, and the AP invoice will be created with the distribution set of rent in Orchid 2. In Orc Limited, I have entered an invoice for customer number 9992, which is configured for Orc Inc. 2, vendor 9991, and I have entered an invoice using the rent distribution code, which translates to the account 4210, and entered the monthly July rental of $10,000. I have also created a PDF of this invoice and saved it away in the document management link folder so that I can view this invoice in the target company. When I go ahead and post this, Inter-Entity Trade recognizes that this vendor-customer relationship has been configured and creates the mirrored transaction in Orchid 2. To check, I can go to my inter-entity transactions inquiries, the AR/AP trade audit. And for Orchid 2, our AR to AP documents, we can see that the source transaction invoice 25 has been sent to the target company batch 33 entry number 1. And going across into Orchid 2, if we open up batch 33, we see the AR invoice has been mirrored to an AP invoice number 25 using the rent distribution, which has distributed it across 2 different GL accounts, and we still have access to the PDF that was created in Orc Limited. This access is provided by Document Management Link. We have just seen how you can raise an AR invoice in Company 1 and the transaction can be mirrored into Company 2 using the configured vendor and accounts or distribution set in Company 2. In the second scenario, we are going to use Orchid's inter-entity transactions as well as Orchid's inter-entity trade to process an AP invoice in Company 1, which needs to be charged on to another group company, Company 4. We're going to post the AP invoice for equipment lease charges in the sales company, Orc Limited. Inter-entity transactions is going to raise an AR invoice in Orc Limited, charging the manufacturing company, Orchid 4. And this is using the configured GL account to raise an AR invoice for the amounts posted to that particular GL trigger account. And then inter-entity trade is going to create a mirrored AP invoice in Orchid 4. An inter-entity trade uses the configuration for the AR customer to AP vendor trade partnership for the target company and for the account mapping. For this second scenario, I have entered the accounts payable invoice from my supplier, ESSA Engineering, for the lease equipment. And I have entered the amount relating to my manufacturing company, the amount of $3,330, I have entered that against the configured GL trigger account 7264-1. And the GL trigger account that has been configured for 7264-1 is an AR reallocation. And so an AR invoice will be created for this amount using customer 9994. And the amount to remain in Entity 1, I have allocated to 6260-1. I've also dragged and dropped the invoice from the supplier into Document Management Link, and I'm now ready to post. And in this demonstration scenario, all the subsequent postings will be done manually, but you can auto-post all these relating transactions if you want to. So when I go ahead and post, as expected, this would create the GL batch. And when I go ahead and post this journal entry, I'm expecting an AR invoice to be created for customer 9994 for $3,330. And then when I post that invoice batch, I'm expecting inter-entity trade to mirror that into the manufacturing company Orc Inc. 4. In the inter-entity inquiries, in the GL Triggers audit inquiry, we can see that an AR reallocation trigger has created a batch number 84, document 1, for customer 9994. And in accounts receivable, we have this invoice batch that we can then go ahead and post. So the customer number is 9994 and the reallocation account was 7264-1. And when I post this batch, IE Trade will create a mirrored AP transaction in our manufacturing company, Orc Inc. 4. And if we go back to the IET inquiries, for the APAR audit inquiries, we see invoice number 26 has been sent to batch 32, document 1 in Orc Inc. 4. And in AP transactions of Orc Inc. 4, our manufacturing company, we see invoice 26 for the same amount. And if we had configured document management link in the manufacturing company, we could choose to see either the invoice coming from Orc Ltd, the sales company, or we could see the original supplier invoice, depending how we want to see that in the manufacturing company. We have now seen the second scenario whereby I entered an AP invoice for the equipment lease charges and charged some of that on to Orc Inc. 4. And when I posted the AP invoice, I had to go to the GL, post the GL invoice. When the inter-entity transactions GL trigger kicked in and created the AR invoice, and then I had to post the AR invoice for inter-entity trade to kick in and create the mirrored AP invoice in Orc Inc. 4. But I could have configured all those batches in between to auto post. So when I posted the AP invoice for the lease charges in the sales company Orc Limited, the GL batch would be created and posted. At the same time, the AR invoice would have been created and posted, and at the same time, the mirrored AP invoice in Orc Inc. 4 would have been created and posted. In this last scenario, we're going to look at inter-entity settlements. We're going to do an AP payment in one company and see the mirrored AR receipt created automatically in the first company. In our case, the distribution company, Orc Inc. 2, is going to pay the sales company, Orc Limited, for rent, and it's going to apply the payment to one of the intercompany invoices. Inter-entity trade creates the AR receipt in Orc Limited applied to the original intercompany invoice using the AP AR vendor to AR customer trade mapping set up in Orc Inc. 2. But we could configure it to happen the other way. If we wanted to, we could configure for the receipts to be made in Orc Limited and for the funds to be drawn from Orc Inc. 2. But in our case, we're going to configure a APAR trade relationship in Orc Inc. 2, saying that any payments made to the AP vendor 9991 in Orc Inc. 2, these payments must be mirrored as receipts into Orc Limited for customer 9992 using the bank account CCB. And they must be applied to the same intercompany invoices that were sent from Orc Limited or from Orc Inc. 2, depending on how you're processing. I am in Orc Inc. 2, the distribution company, and I'm processing a payment to vendor 9991. and this is the vendor that has a trade partner relationship to the customer 9992 in Orc Limited. And any transaction for vendor 9991 in Orking 2 will be mirrored to Orc Limited to customer 9992. And for payments, the bank CCB in Orc Limited will be used. I'm doing a payment of $1,000 and I've applied it to invoice 22. And because Inter-Entity Trade can find invoice 22 in the audit trail as coming from Orc Limited, when I post this payment batch, Inter-Entity Trade will create an AR receipt in Orc Limited for customer 9992 applied to the same invoice. If it was not applied to an invoice, or if it could not find an invoice in the audit trail coming from Orc Limited, it would create an unapplied receipt in Orc Limited. So when I go ahead and post this batch, Inter-Entity Trade will create an AR receipt in Orc Limited. And checking the APAR audit trail in Orking 2, we find that the source AP payment batch 32 entry 1 created batch number 68, and that's an AR receipt batch, entry 1 in the target company, which is Orc Ltd. And in Orc Limited, we see the receipt against bank CCB for customer 9992 and applied to invoice 22. And this could have been order posted if I wanted. And that is the third scenario that I was going to demonstrate, showing you an inter-entity settlement where an AP payment is made in the second company and a mirrored AR receipt is created automatically in the first company, still applied to the same transactions that was created via the inter-entity APAR invoice automation. And now back to Nathalie for some tips and tricks for inter-entity trade.
Thanks, Anne, for this detailed demonstration of inter-entity trade focusing on AP and AR transactions. We've demonstrated an example using Orchid sample data, but now let's look at a few use cases in practice. The fuel trading company in the Caribbean uses inter-entity trade for charging management fees, for intercompany fuel sales, for advances for travel expenses, and allocate rent expense and payroll expenses to various entities. And they also use it in conjunction with inter-entity transactions, actually. We have another example of a consumer packaged goods company that uses inter-entity trade for its 9 entities to transfer inventory between each other, to automatically record the funding between entities, to pay expenses on behalf of other entities, and receive monies on behalf of other entities. And using inter-entity transactions, they can manage intergroup promissory notes as well. In this part of the presentation, we will go through some common support questions and tips on using inter-entity trade. For this, we'll use the FAQ page of the inter-entity trade help. It's available from within inter-entity using the F1 key, and it is also available from the Orchid website. On the Orchid website, on the resources online help, find inter-entity trade. and let's look at the FAQ page. We'll focus on the most important ones. First one is questions we often get is, how do you actually create transactions in inter-entity trade? What's the process of using the application? Once it's set up, users do not manually enter transactions into inter-entity. Once you've tested it, all the related processes become automated. Inter-entity trade will automatically initiate transactions based on the posting of the source transactions in Sage 300. What we recommend you do is that you review the audit inquiry logs regularly to check the transactions that are created and also to identify transactions that failed to post successfully. And one way to remember to do that, if we look at Sage 300, is to use the visual process flow. The top here we have the key steps of setting up inter-entity trade for AP and AR, and below we have the steps to use inter-entity trade for AP and AR. So you post your AP and AR batches. Inter-entity trade will create the balancing transactions, the mirror transactions, and you can then review the trade audit inquiry. If there are any errors, you can use the periodic processing to reprocess the transactions after you've fixed the error. And you also have access to trade audit reports if you need to export the reports. So let's have a quick look at the trade inquiry. So here we can see in the status that all transactions are exported. Exported means it's been successfully created in the target company. We can see where it's gone, org IN2, 4.2. You can see the source document, batch, entry, and document number, as well as the target, batch, entry, and document number. Reminder that on these screens, you can use Control F to filter. So here I can go Control F and filter all transactions for the company org IN2. Control F and clear the filter to see all transactions again. And that applies to all fields, so you could filter on just errors. And you can also use those filter boxes at the top. So that's a really important part of using inter-entity trade. Next question is related. How do I check documents created by inter-entity trade? What happens if there are any errors? And errors can occur for a number of reasons. A very common one is if there is no land pack available at the time of posting the source transactions, or if the user credentials have changed. Details of the errors are recorded in the entity trade audit logs, and it's really important that you check these errors regularly before anyone manually creates the missing transactions, because that could disrupt the chain established in inter-entity trade. If you create the transaction manually, the records don't end up in the audit logs, and future adjustments, or if you're then processing a payment against a receipt, if the invoices aren't in the audit logs, it's not going to follow this normal process. And once you've resolved the root cause of the errors, so resaving the credentials in trade organization setup, for example, then you can reprocess using inter-entity trade periodic processing. There is more detail available here in the online help, in particular different examples of the different error messages, steps to reprocess, and we also have a couple of videos on using the audit log and the periodic processing. So if you're new to inter-entity, or if you need a refresher, I'd encourage you to look at this very carefully. So if we go back to our visual process flow, what we're talking about here, we've looked at the audit inquiry before, is using the periodic processing. Select this, and you can choose all documents or only from to. Typically you would do documents in error or pending, and then you can choose certain types of documents only. So process, check that it's okay, and then the standard process carries on. And if you're not using the process flow, it's sitting here on the IET periodic processing. You've got the AR/AP periodic processing. And the trade audit inquiry is sitting in IET inquiries menu. When you are using OE and PO trade, you have an option to display a message when the transactions are created, which gives you immediately the order number or the PO number that has been created by inter-entity trade. You also have an option to turn off these messages to display no messages at all, and this is particularly useful if you're creating transactions through third-party applications. Next, we have a lot of support questions around mapping fields between the source and the target documents in OE and PO trade. Basically, some fields are always sent from the source document to the target documents. Others will default from the standard Sage OE and PO setup unless you configure some overrides or map some fields in trade options integration. So you can look at all the details in there. With tips on mapping document numbers, we often recommend you let Sage auto-number the transactions and just use the reference to push through the OE or the PO transactions related. You can map items if they're different into different databases, map on hold fields, synchronize optional fields, etc. Inter-entity trade supports serial and lot numbers, and again that kind of assumes that the setup in the source and the target companies are very similar. You can't map the serial numbers and the lot tracking. So if you are using trade OEPO with serial and lots, have a look at this article. Next, does inter-entity trade support project and job costing? Yes, it does support PJC integration. However, there is no mapping of contracts, projects, and activities between the source and the target PJC projects. So this codes used for contracts, projects, and activities on the source transaction must exist in the target transaction as well. So if we look at this in Sage, in IET setup, in our AP/AR trade setup, I can select to include the PJC fields. And this also applies to OE/PO trade setup. We can select include PJC fields. When you start the setup, an important question is what fields can I map between AP and AR documents? So you go to Trade Options, AP/AR Integration tab to specify the information to use. You can transfer fields between the document header and the document details. You can also use the user ID who's creating the transaction and the organization ID. You can concatenate, add together multiple pieces of information, and you can have a separator between the segment. But you need to make sure that the combined length does not exceed the length of the target field. Otherwise, the target field will be truncated when you create the transaction. If you do not map the document number, Sage will auto-generate the next appropriate document number. So we have more details here on the AP/AR Integration tab. We have here the target fields. So if I'm going from AP to AR, these are all the fields I can map into, including the document number, the description, the detailed comment, special instructions, and these are the source fields that I can use. So let's look at this in Sage, in the setup, trade options. And I go to the AP-ER integration tab. So if I choose AP to AR, so here into the AR batch description, I'm using a hyphen as a separator. Could change that to a space or a forward slash, and then I can pass this posting sequence, batch number, organization ID, and user ID. If I wanted to remove the user ID, I can exclude it. And if I want to add it back, choose the user ID and include it. Save. Then I can choose the next field being, say, the detailed description. And in the detailed description, I have access to some of the same fields and other fields as well. I could put the AP document reference. Or in this current example, I'm putting the document detailed description from AP going into AR. Can inter-entity AP-AR auto-post the batches that are created? Yes, it can. It's an option. And you can choose which batches you want to auto-post. AP invoice, AP payment, and when you're setting up AP to AR, you can have the same options for AR invoices and AR receipt batches. Just need to remember that there are a few things to note when using the posting batches. And this is actually here. You need to make sure that the user configured in trade organization setup has sufficient rights in the target database. You also need to deselect forced listing of all batches. If you have selected that option in AP or AR setup, then inter-entity cannot post the batch automatically. And specifically regarding AP, if you select a payment code that uses a check, the payment batch cannot be auto-posted because AP will prompt you to print the check or enter the check numbers. So if you want to auto-post, you need to ensure that the vendor payment code does not use a check payment type, or you leave the default payment code for the vendor blank and choose a default payment code in AP that does not use a check payment type. If we look at this option in Sage 300, it's under Trade Options. AP-AR Trade Options, we have all these options here of auto-posting. And this is summarized here. Does inter-entity trade always use the default tax classes in the target database? Basically, inter-entity trade does not send any tax information across. It takes the main value in the source document, pushes them through to the target. So the target then does its own processing. It will add the tax depending on the AP-AR settings for the customer or the vendor. So if you need to send tax details from the source document, you need to include transaction line tax in AP-AR trade setup in the vendor customer partner. So this is where you set this up in AP-AR trade setup. You can say include transaction line tax, but by default this is not turned on. Question that is maybe less common but is relevant in some cases is, can inter-entity trade create elimination entries when using AP-AR trade? And if there is an option in the AP-AR trade setup to create elimination entry, and in that case you select your elimination company, and then a GL entry will be created in the elimination company for each and every transaction created for this AP-AR trade partnership. If we look here at our AP-AR trade setup, You can see that I've selected Create Elimination Entry, selected my elimination company, and then here where I'm mapping my GL accounts, I can select the GL accounts to use for the elimination entries if we need to map them. How do you enable the GL account expense to revenue account mappings in AP and AR trade? This section on the AP/AR trade screen is only enabled if you use account to account or distribution set mapping in IT trade options. So if you don't see the grid, you need to go and update the options. So let's look at that. First, if we look at our AP/AR trade setup, here we have this grid where we can map the GL accounts if they are different. And in trade options, we have this option here to say use account to account or distribution set mapping. So if this option is not selected, then the grid will not be available. So looking at our AR to AP trade partner here, we have a different example where we're actually allocating any revenue going to the 4210-1 GL account or to the 4210 GL account using a distribution set in the target company. So here I can select a distribution set, and for example, if I put it to the rent account, the rent distribution set, in Org IN2, so in my other company, my rent distribution set can actually split the expense to various GL accounts. So it lets you do one GL account in AR to multiple GL accounts in AP with just one line configuration. So that's also a really useful tip to set up inter-entity trade. And this is actually documented here in the help under using distribution sets in inter-entity trade. We have an example setup and transactions, so I'll encourage you to have a look at that. As we've demonstrated, you can create AR receipts from AP payments and AP payments from AR receipts with inter-entity trade. Question is, does inter-entity trade apply AR receipts to the invoices when it's creating the receipts from AP payments? And basically, if all the invoices in the AP payment can be found in AP AR trade audit or in IE PO trade audit, so they've been somehow linked to inter-entity transactions, then the receipt will be applied to the AR invoices. If an invoice cannot be found as having been processed through AP/AR trade, then the receipt will be set up as an unapplied cash receipt. Final questions is, what are the steps to upgrade inter-entity? This applies to both inter-entity transactions and inter-entity trade. You need to download and install the version that you are upgrading to. You need to activate it in the database. And once that's done, you generally need to resave the Sage 300 details. For inter-entity transactions, you do this in IE entity database mappings. For trade, you do it in trade organization setup. And also a reminder that inter-entity supports the latest changes to Sage 300 security model in version 2023 PU, the latest PU, as well as version 2024. And obviously, as part of the upgrade, you need to test. So as mentioned, after an upgrade, we generally recommend that you come to entity database mappings and re-enter the credential used for each database. And in trade organization setup, this is where we set up the passwords that we need to connect to the databases. Finally, let's have an overview of inter-entity trade working with other Orchid modules. We have demonstrated inter-entity trade in conjunction with inter-entity transactions. For example, to work together with AP and AR reallocation. Many companies use extended developer and scripts or some apps from the marketplace in conjunction with trade, for example, to print OE and PO documents automatically when transactions are created. So the PDF is saved in a configured folder, optionally emailed to the vendor as the documents are being created by inter-entity trade. We can also configure document management link to view documents saved only once against one entity and display them in another entity. And there is a separate video just highlighting how to do this and how this works. Thank you very much for your time, and for more information on inter-entity trade, you can visit our website www.orchid.systems and select the entity trade page. There are also some brochures, videos, case studies, training guides, online help, and other technical resources. We're now open for questions.